Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today I'm going over some new polls that have come out of the state of Georgia that have very important ramifications for the 2026 U.S. Senate race in the state. So new polls come out by Atlanta Journal-Constitution. They're one of the top pollsters in the state of Georgia, and they have four hypothetical matchups for the 2026 Georgia Senate race with Democrat Senator Jon Ossoff and four other potential Republican opponents. In the first matchup, we have the governor of the state of Georgia, Brian Kemp, going up against Jon Ossoff, and this is the only matchup where the Republicans lead. Kemp defeats Ossoff here by plus 3%. Now, it is worth noting that 3% likely falls within the margin of error of the poll, but it is still very significant that Kemp is leading Ossoff, who is the incumbent senator. However, when it's asked Brad Raffensperger versus Jon Ossoff, Ossoff here is leading by 9 points. And the one that's been getting a lot of media attention, Marjorie Taylor Greene, if she were to run against Jon Ossoff, Ossoff has a commanding lead of plus 17 points over Marjorie Taylor Greene. And when it's asking King versus Ossoff, Ossoff leads by 13%. So that's the newest poll in the state of Georgia. Right now, as it's factored into the race overall, Inside Elections, Cook Political Report, and Sabato Crystal Ball all have the race listed as a battleground or toss-up. Race to the White House has it listed as Tilt Democrat. As overall, this feeds into the greater conversation, which appears in the early polling. Only Brian Kemp is the only Republican in the state of Georgia that seems to be able to win. As I mentioned in the poll was conducted between April 15th and April 15th and April 24th of 2025, with a sample size of 1,000 registered voters and a 3.1% margin of error. So the Kemp versus Ossoff margin falls just within the margin of error, which confirms that I do think the 2026 Georgia Senate race is going to be incredibly close and likely one of the closest races in the country for 2026. But Brian Kemp presents the Republicans a top opportunity at getting a good Senate recruit. Not even good Senate recruit, the best Senate recruit they could get for the 2026 cycle. Because when Kemp is not included in the poll, for instance, Brad Raffensperger versus Jon Ossoff, Ossoff is leading in this poll by 8 points from Trafalgar, 9 points in this poll from Atlanta Journal that we just went over. In WPA Intelligence, a Republican-aligned poll, Ossoff is leading by about 14 points. It doesn't stop there. Jon Ossoff versus U.S. Representative Buddy Carter, the Tyson Group poll shows Ossoff leading by about 8 points, and in the WPA poll, it shows Ossoff leading by about 13. Jon Ossoff versus John King, just went over the poll, 51-38 lead for Ossoff over King, and WPA had Ossoff up 47-31. The one that's been getting a lot of media attention, as I mentioned, Marjorie Taylor Greene, says if Brian Kemp does not run for Senate, she would really strongly consider running for this Senate race. She thinks, being such a close ally of President Trump, she'd be able to get a lot of voters that only vote for Trump and don't vote in the midterm elections out to vote for her. And maybe that's true, but if that is the case, a lot of independents would definitely not vote for Marjorie Taylor Greene based on these polls. As in 3 polls now, for Jon Ossoff versus Marjorie Taylor Greene, they have been blowouts in every single one. Jon Ossoff has 48%, Marjorie Taylor Greene has 37% in the new Trafalgar poll. Out of the Atlanta Journal poll I just mentioned, 54-37 lead for Ossoff over Greene. And Tyson Group, 51-39 for Ossoff over Greene as well. It doesn't end there. Mike Collins, Ossoff's leading by 5 in one poll, 10 in another. McCormick, Ossoff is up by 11. Jon Ossoff versus a generic Republican by single back in March showed it a tied race. But when you actually go through the matchups, it's pretty clear Jon Ossoff is favored to win whatever Republican opponent he faces, except for Brian Kemp, which makes this decision so incredibly crucial. As we know, the Democratic senator in Georgia, Jon Ossoff, he's one of 2. He is going to be the Democratic nominee without question. He already has been raising a lot of money. He's raised over almost nearly $32 million as of March 31st. He spent over $25 million with $11 million cash on hand. So from an election standpoint, Jon Ossoff, even though he is certainly endangered electorally, money-wise, he's getting the money he needs to be competitive for 2026, and he's in a strong position for a very close re-election effort. The question is, does Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, decide to run for this race? And as I showed you in the polls, Brian Kemp represents the Republicans' best chance. And make no mistake, if Brian Kemp does not run, there's a huge list of Republicans that could run for this race. There's Buddy Carter, a U.S. rep, Mike Collins, a U.S. rep, Marjorie Taylor Greene, a U.S. rep, Tyler Harper, John King, Rich McCormick, and Brad Raffensperger. All of them could run against Ossoff, but the polls clearly show Brian Kemp is the strongest Republican at potentially beating Jon Ossoff. And make no mistake, no matter what happens, it's going to be close no matter what. In 2022, we saw Raphael Warnock win re-election against Herschel Walker by just 2.8%. So it was a very close race, but the Democrat was able to win there. Back in 2020, when Ossoff and Warnock were both elected for the first time, Ossoff only won in the runoff election by 1.2% against David Perdue. So again, a very, very close race. Warnock won by 2.1% against Kelly Loeffler. And Georgia, even though the trends in the Atlanta metro area, it did continue to trend a little bit towards the Democratic side, but it is worth noting in 2024, Donald Trump did flip the state of Georgia back to the Republican side by 2.2%. So what this tells me for Georgia is Georgia might be the closest, most competitive swing state in all of the United States, both for 2026 and even possibly for 2028. This Senate race in 2026, the Georgia Senate race, is 100% winnable for both the Democrats and the Republicans. And Jon Ossoff is going to be a very formidable Democratic senator running for re-election. The question will be, who do the Republicans nominate for 2026? Right now, my own personal predictions are as follows. If it's Jon Ossoff versus Brian Kemp, I have Brian Kemp narrowly winning the state of Georgia by under 1 point. Even though Brian Kemp is leading in these polls by a few points, they are very close. They're almost all under the margin of error. I think Kemp versus Ossoff will be very close. And it may even take a runoff election with neither candidate getting above 50%, but I think Brian Kemp would win by under 1% of the vote in a very close race. If Brian Kemp decides to not run and that's taken out of the equation, by the way, that would be a Republican flip as well. Let's go down the list. Jon Ossoff versus a U.S. representative. Let's pick one from the potential list. Let's say Buddy Carter or Mike Collins. Neither one of them are as well known statewide as Brian Kemp. Let's say it's one of them versus Jon Ossoff. I think Jon Ossoff then wins re-election, probably without a runoff election. I think he wins. He gets over 50% of the vote on the first ballot very, very narrowly. And I have to do this because it is a realistic possibility. Jon Ossoff versus Marjorie Taylor Greene. I am going on a limb here, making a statement. I think that is one of the biggest mistakes the Republicans could do, would be running Marjorie Taylor Greene in 2026. The early polls show Jon Ossoff would absolutely crush her. She is not well liked at all by independents or Democrats, and even a small percentage of Republicans. She would get absolutely crushed by Jon Ossoff in this race, so much so that I think Ossoff would win the night of by over 5% of the vote, which for the state of Georgia, for a Democrat, is not easy to do, and I think Ossoff would win big. The Republicans have a real opportunity at flipping the state of Georgia back to their column in 2026 in a state President Trump won in 2024, even in an election environment that should be a very good night for the Democrats, and at this point in time, I am expecting to be a very good night for the Democrats. I think the Democrats will likely hold New Hampshire and could potentially flip Maine, North Carolina, and even hold Michigan. Georgia presents a good opportunity for the Republicans to flip a seat in 2026. If the Republicans run Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think that takes Georgia pretty much off the table altogether, and the Republicans need to start looking closely at Michigan and New Hampshire as better alternatives, because I don't think Marjorie Taylor Greene is the right type of Republican to try and win that Senate race. But Brian Kemp is. Brian Kemp, I do think, could win the state of Georgia. It'd be very close, but I think it's possible. But I cannot stress this enough. This decision of what Brian Kemp will do is going to severely alter what the 2026 Senate map ends up looking like. Because if Brian Kemp does not run, my next matchup or my next rankings for the Senate map following that news, I would have Georgia being as lean Democrat. I would no longer has it listed as a battleground. Because I think Georgia, with Jon Ossoff, Georgia likes Jon Ossoff and could reelect him, but Brian Kemp presents the one Republican that could potentially flip that. It's a similar situation in New Hampshire with Chris Sununu. Georgia's more of a Republican state than New Hampshire, but Chris Sununu, I think, was the one Republican that could win the state of New Hampshire. Now that he's not running, it's likely going to be Chris Pappas versus Scott Brown. I have New Hampshire right now as lean Democrat, and I think Georgia would be a very similar situation to that if Kemp were not to run. But if the Republicans were to double down and put up someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, then I think that's really tripling down on the fact that I think we may see Georgia go as Democratic as we may see as like New Hampshire or Minnesota or something of that nature. But I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to leave a comment below telling me your thoughts about this poll and about what you think about Ossoff's chances in 2026. Do you think Kemp will run? If he does not, what do you think the race will end up looking like? Also, make sure to like and subscribe as I post at least 2 new videos every day you're not going to want to miss. Again, thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next video.